let's jump right in. If you were to wander into the Victoria and Albert Museum in London for their massive Great Mughals exhibition, you'd be hit immediately by this beautifully curated celebration of India's golden age. We're talking that sweet spot roughly between 1560 and 1660. You know, Akbar's bold religious tolerance, Jahangir's total obsession with art, and Shah Jahan carving out these monuments of mourning in stunning white marble. It's absolutely breathtaking. But there's a catch. When we look at this standard highlight reel version of Mughal history, we're actually missing a really crucial opening chapter. It's kind of like the beginning of the story has just been politely trimmed from the frame. So in today's explainer, we're going to put that missing prologue right back where it belongs.
Okay, let's dive into this by contrasting the popular narrative with the actual gritty reality. Usually, we picture an empire of insane opulence that just seemingly springs up out of nowhere in India, defined by these grand conquests and massive monuments. But the true origins? Well, they didn't start in Delhi, and they definitely didn't start with conquest. This whole thing started with a displaced refugee named Babur just trying to survive the snowy, mountainous terrain of Kabul. If Mughal India was the empire's grand, glittering stage, then the cities of modern-day Afghanistan were its rehearsal rooms.
We really need to completely reframe how we view the founder of this empire, Babur. He wasn't some starry-eyed adventurer from day one, or a grand conqueror dreaming of taking over India. Actually, he didn't even like India. But, well, we'll get to that in a second. Babur was just a vulnerable young man who had literally lost everything. What he actually wanted, with this aching, desperate nostalgia, was to reclaim his lost Central Asian home of Samarkand, the city of his Timurid forefathers.
The chaos of his early life just built so rapidly. I mean, imagine being Babur for a second. At just 14 years old, he captures his absolute dream city of Samarkand, only to lose it almost immediately. Then he takes it again and loses it again. By the time he hits 21, he's a wandering fugitive. He's a disappointed heir wearing this heavy cloak of failure, and all this happens before his beard has even properly grown in. Finally, in the year 1504, desperate, pretty much broke, and completely out of options, he crosses the snowy Hindu Kush mountains and arrives at the gates of Kabul. And he takes control of the city honestly more out of sheer fatigue than through some terrifying, brilliant military campaign. And this brings us to one of the absolute best parts about studying Babur, his voice. His autobiography reveals this devastatingly dry wit. He writes, "To wander from mountain to mountain, hopeless and homeless, has nothing to recommend it." I mean, how relatable is that? This is what makes learning about this era so captivating. We aren't just reading the stiff, formulaic chronicles of some distant, untouchable emperor. We're hearing the deeply human, emotionally unguarded, and totally vulnerable voice of a young guy just trying to make sense of his failures.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how Kabul functioned as the absolute perfect incubator for what would eventually become the Mughal Empire. Look, Kabul wasn't an imperial capital. It didn't have glittering, gold-covered palaces. But what it did have was immense potential. Nestled in this fertile valley, surrounded by jagged passes, it was a massive hub for trade routes. You had caravans coming from Delhi, Shiraz, Samarkand, Baghdad, all resting there. And that brought this vibrant, buzzing mingling of ideas, languages, books, and political gossip. For Babur, who had just lost his ancestral home, Kabul offered something totally new: stability. It gave him a vision. He didn't just rule the city, he breathed it.
It was right there in Kabul that Babur really honed his voice, culminating in the Baburnama. Now, this text is widely considered one of the greatest autobiographies in all of Islamic literature, and historians consistently praise it as one of the finest primary sources in history, period. Written in Chagatai Turkish and beautifully laced with these Persian poetic interludes, it's kind of this incredible mashup. It's a war journal, a travelogue, and a catalog of longing all rolled into one.
He wrote about everything with just startling honesty. Right in the middle of chapters detailing brutal siege warfare and crushing military defeats, Babur will just pivot and write, "The Kabul melons are renowned. They are held to be the best in the world." He literally gives equal passionate attention to the flavor of melons and varieties of apricots as he does to his life or death battles. He even wrote frankly about his unrequited love for a boy named Baburi, noting, "His beauty stole my heart." You know, this isn't the standard PR-filtered language of an empire builder. It's the highly relatable diary of a man figuring out exactly who he is.
But Kabul wasn't the only city that shaped him. In 1506, Babur traveled west to Herat. And if Kabul was the empire's rehearsal room, Herat was for sure its library. This was the last great city of Timurid elegance, ruled by Sultan Hussein Baikara. Herat was a world completely apart from the rugged, harsh mountains. It was just overflowing with bookshops, music, Sufis, and wine. It's said there were more poets and scholars walking the streets than soldiers.
Babur was absolutely enchanted by Herat. He went to poetry readings, flirted shamelessly, and just soaked up the entire culture. I absolutely love this irreverent little quote he wrote about the city. In Herat, a man can't stretch out his leg without touching a poet's backside. He called it the finest city in the world. But tragically, shortly after his visit, an Uzbek warlord named Shaibani Khan swept down. He took the city, smashed its beautiful libraries, killed Babur's cousins, and forced his sister Khanzada into marriage as a political pawn. In an instant, the light of Herat went out.
So returning to Kabul, Babur has this stark realization. He's one of the very last Timurid rulers still standing. So in the year 1508, he makes a massive, super deliberate shift in his identity. He formally laid claim to his legacy by adopting the Persian title Padshah, which means king. He finally stopped dreaming of recovering his lost past in Samarkand. Instead, he turned his gaze eastward, past the familiar mountains, and looked toward Hindustan.
The really crucial point here is why he looked to India. It wasn't because he felt some grand divine destiny to build an Indian empire. Not at all. It was just an unromantic, logistical necessity. From his vantage point, India was wealthy, it was divided, and it was the perfect place to reinvent himself and support his modest kingdom. In fact, he dismissively described the whole idea of invading India as simply going to the provinces. He treated it like a mere extension of the world he already controlled in Kabul and Kandahar.
This highly pragmatic approach culminated in 1526 with the famous First Battle of Panipat. Now, you'll often see this date highlighted in textbooks as the glorious start of the Mughal Empire. Babur's forces were totally outnumbered, but he brilliantly used field artillery to just shatter the army of Sultan Ibrahim Lodi. But we have to remember, for Babur, marching into India wasn't the fulfillment of some lifelong dream. He was just a hardened survivor taking out what he bluntly called Hindustan's petty rulers.
And hey, if you think he was thrilled with his shiny new conquest, think again. Babur perfectly subverts our expectations of a triumphant conqueror because he openly disliked his new territory. He found it way too hot, too flat, and the customs were totally unfamiliar to him. He wrote with his trademark frankness, "The country of Hind is a place of little charm. There are no good grapes. The melons and grapes are different from those of Kabul. The air is hot and the water brackish." Simply put, the guy was incredibly homesick. Even as the incredibly powerful ruler of Delhi, his heart never really left the mountains. He consistently referred to Kabul as his vilayat, which is this beautiful term that blends the concept of a physical homeland with a really deep sense of spiritual belonging. For Babur, Kabul wasn't just a capital city on a map. It was the ultimate model of kingship. It was the exact place that had saved him from despair and taught him how poetry, politics, and power could seamlessly coexist. And this brilliantly illustrates how the physical culture of the Mughal Empire was actually born. Think of those iconic, beautifully symmetrical Mughal gardens we see in India today. That classical four-part garden style, the Chahar Bagh, which is inspired by Persian cosmology, was actually designed and refined by Babur back in Kabul. It was in Kabul that he wrote his memoirs, meticulously planned his gardens, and sketched the aesthetic blueprint that his descendants would later famously export to India. Babur's time in India was incredibly short. He died in 1530, which was just 4 years after his major victory at Panipat. But even in death, he knew exactly where he belonged. He left clear, insistent instructions not to be buried in the wealthy imperial cities he had just conquered. Instead, his remains were carried back through those exact same mountain passes he had crossed decades earlier as a broken refugee. He was laid to rest in a peaceful garden overlooking Kabul, surrounded by his beloved apricot trees.
Which brings us to the core of today's explainer, and a question I want to leave you chewing on. If we only remember the conqueror in India, whose history are we actually erasing? To start the story of the Mughals with the towering marble domes of India is to tell only half the story. The empire was born in exile, in the valleys of Kabul and in the pages of an emotionally raw journal. I really hope the next time you see Mughal art or architecture, you look past the opulence and remember the displaced young prince who quietly sketched the outline of an empire in Afghanistan. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it completely changes how you view this incredible piece of history.